G'day everyone and welcome to Inside Rugby with Mark. Yes, I'm back. I hope you all had a fantastic Christmas and New Year break. I certainly did, and I'm ready to get into some rugby talk for 2024 and lots of exciting things happening in the rugby world this year, that's for sure. Now in this video, the first of the year, I thought I'd look at that vacant Australian Wallabies position for coach and just see who we think might get that job. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about Joe Schmidt as being one of the main contenders for that role. So welcome back to the channel everybody. Yes, I've had a little bit of a break, feeling refreshed and back into it for 2024 with the rugby community across the world. And in today's video, I just thought we'd have a look at Joe Schmidt as being a possibility for that Wallabies head coaching role in 2024. But before we get into that, I think it's probably a good idea to have a look at the background of that coaching role when it comes to foreigners coming in and coaching the Wallabies. So I'm going to touch on that in this video. Now, of course, with the removal of Eddie Jones from the head coaching position of the Australian Wallabies, it's left that position vacant, and Rugby Australia have been saying that they're looking for the best candidate to fill that role. Now, there's a lot of good coaches around the world at the moment, and there's a lot of good coaches that are out of a job. So it's been an interesting conversation to have, I guess, in terms of who could possibly fill that role. Now, a couple of Kiwi names have come up, and it's been interesting to go through the history with Kiwis coaching the Australian Wallabies team. And if you don't know, there's a great rivalry that happens between Australia and New Zealand. And that rivalry is born about because we're such alike as far as natures, cultures and countries go. But there are some significant differences, and there's been a lot made in the past about the cultural differences between the Australians and the New Zealanders when it comes to coaching the Australian team. Now, if we go back in history, we'll know that Robbie Deans, the ex-New Zealand All Black fullback, he took on the role as the Wallabies head coach back in 2008. And surprisingly to some, he had the longest tenure as Wallaby coach in their history. He lasted right through until the 2013 Lions Tour of Australia. And that made Robbie Deans tick over 75 games in charge of the Australian Wallabies. And that's actually more than any other coach who's coached the Wallabies in the past. So that was quite an interesting experiment. Now, what seemed to go wrong there was he lost the dressing room, so it was said. And there was a lot of ex-players at the time who seemed to be after Robbie Deans' head, and the Australian Wallabies came together as a unit to really get Robbie Deans out of that position. And it was a tenure of an All Black, ex-All Black of the Wallabies that ended in 2013. And there was a lot made of that and of what happened afterwards as well. Now, whilst in charge of the Wallabies, Robbie Deans had a 59% winning record. And it was what happened after Deans left that made it quite interesting when you look back on his success with the Wallabies. And whilst he only won 3 games against the All Blacks out of 18 attempts, it was actually a period where it seems as though Australian rugby was moving forward when Robbie Deans was in charge. Now, after he left, there was 2 Australian coaches in a row over the next 7 years. McKenzie took over from Robbie Deans, and then Michael Checker came into the position as well. Now, over that 7 years, those 2 guys combined had a success rate of just over 50% of winning their games. So they didn't actually get to the level that Robbie Deans was. But the important thing for Rugby Australia at the time was there were Australians in charge of the Australian Rugby Union team. Now, it wasn't until Dave Rennie came in to the Australian Wallabies head coaching role after the 2019 Rugby World Cup that Rugby Australia had to decide to go with another foreign, or had decided to go with another foreign coach coming into the fray. And I really liked the appointment of Dave Rennie. I thought at the time that he was going to have a lot of success with the Australian Wallabies. And if the Australian Rugby Union gave him an opportunity to build a new culture and build a new platform for the players around him, then I thought that Dave Rennie was going to have a good shot. That wasn't the case. They didn't stick with him long enough, I felt, and he didn't have a very good track record in terms of his 41% winning record as the head coach of the Australian Wallabies. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with his downfall. But it seemed to be the case that there was a lot of pressure once again from those within Rugby Australia that there wasn't an Australian as the head coach of the Australian Rugby Union team, and that experiment again by putting a Kiwi in charge didn't seem to work out. And as we all know, early in 2023 Dave Rennie got his marching orders and the vacancy came up once again for the head coaching role of Australia. Now we all know what happened next, and it was Eddie Jones that was appointed to the head coaching role. And of course Eddie straight away off the bat started to make some decisions that riled up not only the Australian supporters but a lot of people across the rugby world. And I think by going to the Rugby World Cup in France last year without Quade Cooper and Michael Hooper really were two things that came back to haunt Eddie Jones in the end, although he didn't seem to be too concerned about that. But after Australia's poor performance at the Rugby World Cup in France in 2023, the writing was on the wall, and it was only a matter of time that Rugby Australia had to act yet again and get rid of Eddie Jones. And of course all that talk around Eddie Jones going to Japan even prior to the Rugby World Cup starting last year left a bad taste in many people's mouth when it came to rugby in Australia. And despite all the denials, where did Eddie Jones end up going? Yes, he ended up going to Japan. And of course we wish him all the very best with the Cherry Blossoms. He did a good job there last time, but we'll have to wait and see whether Eddie can turn his coaching career around along with the Cherry Blossoms form as they head towards the next World Cup, which ironically is going to be down there in Australia in 2027. So when Eddie Jones left the Australian Wallabies, the vacancy sign went out again, and they're starting the process again to look for a head coach of the Wallabies team. And one must think that this is going to be a very, very critical appointment as Australian rugby tries to get back on its feet and head towards 2027 with some positivity and, more importantly, some results on the field. So a lot of people are talking about Joe Schmidt, and when I say a lot of people in Australia are talking about Joe Schmidt. And the Rugby Australia Chief Executive Phil Waugh has talked about there's no reason why a foreign coach can't come in and create the kind of systems and structures and platform that Australian rugby needs to be successful. Some interesting vocabulary being used from Phil Waugh about the possible appointment of a foreign coach into that position. So the whole point of this video is to really ask the question of you, and to share my opinion as well, whether we think that Joe Schmidt might be the right man to head Australia into the next Rugby World Cup in Australia in 2027. Now there's a lot of positives I think of Joe Schmidt. I watched him a lot when he was in the Irish setup, and there's no doubt about it that he helped Andy Farrell a lot in that process and really was one of the components that came together to help Ireland really increase their winning performance in the top echelons of world rugby. And a lot of kudos has to go to Joe Schmidt's role in that process. And we saw the same thing again when he went to New Zealand and he was involved with Ian Foster and Jason Ryan and that All Blacks team that went to the Rugby World Cup last year, and some significant impacts that Joe Schmidt made for that All Black team. I think he was very instrumental in helping them around the breakdown and the lineouts in particular, and creating some new structures that allowed the All Blacks to have the ball in hand a lot more of the time. And if you look at the statistics from the Rugby World Cup, the All Blacks were the team that had ball in hand the most of any team in this year's Rugby World Cup, averaging 20 minutes per game with ball in hand. So that was an interesting factor and one of the key components that Joe Schmidt helped the All Blacks develop in their particular game. But outside of that, the word in the dressing room is that he's a great guy to be around. He's very much a team player, and he knows how to motivate the people, but also give them the skills they need to go on and do the job whilst believing in themselves. And I think that's a really, really big component of anybody going into the Australian Wallaby setup, because let's face it, a lot of those Wallabies have lost their self-belief. They've been through some pretty tough times at that Rugby World Cup in France last year, and it's going to take a good mentor and a good coach to bring them around again. And I think Joe Schmidt is definitely a person that can do that. So what could be the negatives of Joe Schmidt going into that role as the Australian head coach if he was to be appointed? Well, I think there's always going to be that cultural issue between the Australians and the New Zealanders. And it may be something where we say, well, you know, we fought in wars together over the years. The Anzacs are such a strong camaraderie. But when it comes to rugby and that culture between the two nations, they are very different and they have their nuances that need to be ironed out. So I'm not sure whether Joe Schmidt is capable of doing that. He probably is, but he's going to need to be given some time to build that kind of culture within the Australian setup. So like any professional sports team, winning is everything, and I think whoever comes into that coaching role for the Australian Wallabies is going to have to hit the ground running. And I think Joe Schmidt's got just as much chance as anybody else of being able to be successful in that role, but I think it's going to take a fairly unique character to be able to turn this tide around at Australian rugby. And I don't think it's just what happens on the field that he's going to have to be concerned about if he was the one to put up his hand for this role, because as we know, there's a lot going on off the field of Australian rugby. The structures of the game in Australia need to be seriously looked at, and the way the game is played, right from grassroots right up through academies and into the Super Rugby Series. I think that's a really important thing for Australian rugby to iron out. And if someone like Joe Schmidt comes in, I don't know how adept they are at dealing with a structure around them that's not going very well at all. And some people referred to Australian rugby in the last 12 months a little bit like the Titanic, and needing an instant resurrection from their perils that they're facing at the moment. So let's look on the positive side. Let's look at the possibilities of Joe Schmidt coming in and actually making a significant difference and turning this Australian Wallaby team around so they can have success on the field. I'd be really interested in your views on this one. Do you think Joe Schmidt is the guy for the job? Do you think if offered he would accept it? That's the other thing. And if Joe Schmidt doesn't get this job as the Australian head coach of the Wallabies, where does he go? Where does he end up? And what do you see as his next steps in world rugby? I'd like to have your opinions on that in the comments, and I'll read them with much interest. So there you go, there's my thoughts around the possibility of Joe Schmidt becoming the next Australian Wallabies head coach. And yeah, it's going to be a really interesting scenario to see what actually unfolds with this. It could be one of those situations that it makes or breaks his coaching career, because the Australian coaching role seems to do that to a number of people. And if you don't think Joe Schmidt's going to be the guy that gets the job, who do you think is actually a strong candidate for that position in Australia? Do you think Michael Cheika might come back into the fray again? There's a name that's out there at the moment, with Contaponi taking over the Argentinian Puma role. It might be interesting to see where Michael Cheika ends up. But also let me know in the comments what you think. Okay, I'm going to be back on the treadmill now with lots coming up on Inside Rugby with Mark, right here from beautiful Cancun in Mexico. Make sure you stick around. 2024 is going to be a big year. We've got the Six Nations coming up very soon. I'm going to be giving my thoughts on all those games as we head into them, and also giving you my full analysis on each of those games in this year's Six Nations. So time to say goodbye for now. Until next time, stay safe, stay well everyone. It's good to be back, and I'll see you again really soon. Bye for now.